Taking our muslin changes back to paper is something people don't really show a lot. I think it's assumed that it's really easy and simple, but it used to be a mystery to me, so I'm going to show you how I do that today. Here is the muslin I marked up on Lara in early November. You can see there's lots of pins, there are some other marks. So the first order of business is to organize my space so that I have some thread for thread marking and have everything I need. I need some chalk. I want to make sure I have the correct marks that I'm going to be transferring back to the paper with the tracing wheel and the graphite paper. I'm speeding up the video because you don't need to watch me fiddle with my tools for 15 minutes. This works if you drafted the pattern or traced it off a commercial one. Here's my to-do list. It's hard to read. Lengthen the shoulders, adjust the darts, adjust the hemline, and redraft the sleeve. I'm also dancing. I kept forgetting that I was being recorded, I guess. So sorry if that's distracting. I'm definitely listening to music of some kind. I need my thimble because I'm going to be thread tracing a little. Here I am double checking that I have the center front on the correct grain line. This linen is a little bit wiggly, so one thing I like to do when I'm taking it back to paper is to make super sure that I have marked straight down one thread. Because this corset cover is meant to be a completely straight front, I know that, and I need to be sure that I am on the correct one that we used when we did the fitting. And I just make sure I get to the right place where I'm starting to trace off the seam line. I'm double checking that I know exactly where I need to start pinning it to the paper so it's straight at the center front. Now I changed views so you can see better where I've marked the exact lines for seam lines for the shoulder, because we did have to extend the shoulder height. And again, I've sped up where I'm marking the changes. I'm using chalk to get a really clear line exactly where those pins are keeping my dart changes for me. Those white stitched lines are the original pattern, which gave us a start, but it doesn't correct for Laura's figure. Especially on one side, Laura needs a much narrower dart. Like many people, she has one side of her body a little more fullness, or actually a little bit less fullness on the other side. So it's a little bit bigger than the other side, and this just helps us to adjust for that. So it's correct on the body, and it will not be noticeable when the garment is made up. But in the flat, you do see where the dart needed to move over a little bit and also be a little shallower. And parts of it, because it's worn over, I would call it relatively firm corset, you have these almost straight lines on those darts that almost never happen on a figure without something giving it a lot of support. Not on my figure, anyway. And you see here on the left side, I'm actually rubbing out where my dart was too low just to make sure I trace the correct place. I also like to add register marks on those darts because they are so long and tall. You can't just assume that you're going to be able to match the dart legs the way you do with a drafted dart that is kind of calculated. This is a draped dart, so you have to give yourself a little bit more help when you're matching the fabric. I also like to mark left and right as I'm taking apart seams. For some reason, I decided to use Japanese for the right, but English for the left panels. As you're working with the pieces that you've unpicked, they can look a lot alike and get upside down or sideways or backwards, and you want to be sure that you're marking the correct one, especially when there is some asymmetry to the body and left and right actually matter. Kitty. Now we have Matcha supervising. She's making sure that I remember to keep my grain line straight. My primary purpose in life is actually to entertain and hang out with her, and she likes to be sure that I remember that as we work together. She's also constantly assessing my work for completeness. Here what I'm doing is truing up the seam lines. My seam lines are marked here, and I'm walking one seam line along the other one so that it matches. It's the same length. This pattern does not really have any easing in the seams, so they should all be the same length. And it's important, especially when you've traced off from a wiggly fabric, to check that your seam lines are the same. It just saves frustration later. So I like to just check that I haven't made one line longer than the other one, which with these curves, it's easy to do that. And the way you check that is you just literally follow one line down the other one, looking through the paper. Sometimes it means you have to just sort of true up by slightly shortening one of the edges or lengthening one of the edges. I like to make sure that when I do that, that I have made that corner with the seam either 90 degrees or equal to 180 degrees with its joining seam. It makes it easier to put the garment together, even though it's a curved line. You have to have a little 90-degree angle coming off of that seam line. So you'll have brief periods where the garment has relative straightness internal to itself. I hope that makes sense. I'm using a really inexpensive graphite paper by Saral. I like it because I can actually erase it on the paper. There is a waxier paper that is sold in some couture shops that is great for when you're making something that you want to be a permanent mark. And it's very makes a great clear mark. But this graphite paper is perfect for a pattern trace off where I'm just wanting to be able to adjust the lines a little bit. And then I go over that graphite again with just a regular pencil or a narrow, relatively fine marker because it is a little bit faint and it can rub off as you're working with your paper and your fabric. I want to be sure when I send this to Laura that this pattern is usable and doesn't give her any trouble. And so what I'm doing here is I have the original paper pattern that I had traced off for this particular piece, and the main changes were all to the inside of that piece. So I'm labeling which side it is, and then I'm just going to trace back into that piece of paper instead of retracing it from blank paper. It saves me having to figure out the exact grain line, etc. And it appears I have confirmed for myself that I am on the right track and also that I am just sitting down and taking care of the notes that I need. As Kenneth King likes to say, take notes as if you were going to be struck with amnesia. You never know if something will come up and you won't be able to finish your project right away. It helps to leave little notes for yourself so you can pick the project right back up. In this case, again, I'm sending it to another person and I want to be sure that she doesn't have to guess what to do. And it's also a matter of wanting to just be sure to help yourself in the future because a number of times I have thought, I'm going to do this tomorrow or I'm going to do this next week. And then something happened and I didn't come back to that project for, up to a year or two. It's not, it makes your life easier. It makes it easier to actually use that previous work when you have good notes. Don't, don't, no. It's really important when you're working with a small predator in your sewing space to just keep an eye on your pins, especially when your pin ball looks just like a very popular cat toy. She's offended that I told her she can't play with the pinball and is getting ready to leave. And here's what my table looks like about halfway through the process. As a bonus, I realized that I could have just cut open that sleeve pattern piece to widen it because it's a really basic sleeve draft. It's barely even a sleeve. It's mainly there, honestly, to keep your clothes clean. It is actually a really great example of kind of the last gasp of one of the ways that we used to use our underwear to keep our dresses and outer clothes clean, which is to always have a little bit of linen or cotton snugging up into the armpit. And this corset cover has these little tiny sleeves that are kind of a tapered rectangle shape. And because I had to change the shoulder depth, that completely changed the arm's eye. And it meant that this original sleeve was just not going to fit. Sometimes you can copy the slightly larger size to get a longer draft, but that also changes all the proportions. So I decided I would just take a measurement for the seam line for the arm's eye. I've drafted that line down this piece of paper all the way. And then what I do is I take the general shape, I check the depth of the whitest part, and there's no ease in this sleeve. There's not really anything to think about with a sleeve head, if you will, or a shoulder gathering. So I just apply that width to the length of that line. And first I need to get more paper. And one thing that you need to remember when you're working with paper is not using your nice sewing shears, because honestly, it's not good for them, but they're also not really the best thing for paper. I have a specific pair of paper scissors that I got customized a few years ago with twins and needles and paper embossed on them so that I don't ever confuse them. And they're also black, which both fits my goth sensibilities and makes them look very different than every other piece of pair of shears in the house. That way I don't accidentally use fabric shears on paper. I also sometimes honestly keep a pair of just toddler scissors in my travel sewing bag because I'm not worried about those, and they have blunt points, so no one's going to take them away from me. And those are just good to have handy in your travel kit. And I'm checking the width of the center as provided by the pattern, and then just draft a nice little arc. A lot of people are really intimidated by drafting, even a draft that's very, very basic like this one, and they'll do a lot of paper manipulation or pattern manipulation, or they'll buy a bunch of patterns, or they'll even just make things that don't quite fit because they're afraid of pattern drafting. I really encourage you, if you have the privilege to spend some time working through some drafting books, it really can just be a big game changer. Just having the confidence to say to yourself, I can draft that or I can try that, is really empowering. And it's a skill that we used to cultivate as makers. It does take some cultivation. You're not going to just out of nowhere be able to do it the first time. If you take the time to practice and muslin things out and view muslin process as core to your making time, you will start to get a better sense, even when you're using or looking at commercial patterns, about if they're going to fit you. Or it just helps to be able to look at a flat pattern and say, hey, is this going to work for me? Or is this going to be a lot of extra work to get this to fit? Should I just try either a different pattern or draft it myself? Just being able to look at a flat piece and see, okay, this is going to work, or this is going to be a lot of changes, is very helpful to honestly, ultimately saving you time. And that lets you save your time for the things that matter to you. And I find ultimately, if you learn to draft, that you do save time in the end. So I've also just cut that pattern piece in half. I've added the length that I needed to the center and then smoothed the line. But this was faster because I knew how to do it. And it will help save Laura some frustration because I know that that sleeve will fit into that arm hole, arm's eye. One nice thing you can do, especially if the pattern is meant to be symmetrical, is you can pretty much draft one half. You fold your paper in half and trace along the line that you just drew with your tracing wheel, open it back up, and there's your symmetrical pattern piece. You don't have to try to draw 4 equal corners the same way 4 times. Thank you for joining me in my library. I hope that you have a wonderful day. I hope you consider adjusting and drafting your own patterns. Don't. No.